Good afternoon, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you all to this, I think, 7th policy lecture in our Trade Dialogue series. Our speakers today are Professor Jens Südekum from the Düsseldorf Institute of Competition Economics and Professor Farid Toubal from the École Normale Supérieure de Paris-Saclay, not Cachan, or somewhere in between. Jens Südekum is Professor of International Economics at the Düsseldorf Institute of Competition Economics and a Research Fellow at CEPR, CECIFO, IZA, and the Institute for Employment Research. Jens received his PhD from the University of Göttingen in 2003. His current research addresses the impact of globalization across local labor markets in Germany. He has been an advisor to various public institutions on regional policy and trade policy. Farid is professor at the École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay. He's a researcher at CREST and a CES-IFO Research Network member. He's also scientific advisor at CEPI and a member of the French Council of Economic Analysis. He was previously chair of the Economics and Management Department at the ENS of Paris-Saclay and associate professor at Paris School of Economics. He holds a PhD from Kiel University and spent his postdoctorate at the Deutsche Bundesbank and Tübingen University. His primary fields of research are international economics and applied econometrics. His work analyzes various aspects of globalization, and most recently he focused on the analysis of the impact of globalization on labor market outcomes. Both Jens and Farid will discuss the role of international trade and technology, and thus provide more insights into the type of jobs that globalization creates in advanced economies. I wish to warmly thank both of them for having accepted our invitation to come and present the results of their research here in Geneva today. Each of them will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we will have the usual session of questions and answers. And I think Jens will start. So Jens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here and talk about, as you say, technology, trade, and structural change, some lessons from Germany. So actually, I would like to structure my talk into 3 parts. I would like to start with a few remarks about the effect of technology and trade in the United States, because this issue has received a lot of attention in both the academic and the public debate recently, also in the context of the recent presidential election in the US. Then in the second and main part, I'd like to shift attention to the case of Germany and report some results of my own research, and kind of point at similarities and also notable differences between how the German and the American labor market have reacted to globalization. And then the third part, I'd actually like to draw some policy conclusions from my own work. But let me actually start with some observations about the United States and the labor market in the United States. So this figure here shows you that if you go back in time to 1960, roughly 25% of all workers in the United States have worked in the manufacturing sector. Right? And this manufacturing employment share that you see here in the dark figure, right, has constantly decreased since 1960 to around 12% at the turn of the millennium to just below 9% today. Right? So, and this decline of manufacturing jobs has been worrisome to many observers, right? Because manufacturing jobs, traditional industry jobs, are still considered by many as quote-unquote good jobs, as opposed to lower-paid service jobs. So good jobs, especially for workers without a university education. So, and there's a very important question: what is behind this manufacturing decline in the labor market? So now there's another figure. The blue figure here shows you that even over the extremely long time horizon, since 1960, the share in manufacturing in real output has basically changed, is unchanged, has not changed, has stayed entirely flat over time. So what this tells you is that the United States has produced ever more industrial output with ever fewer workers involved in the production processes. And it also gives you already a flavor what will be the main driver of this decline of manufacturing employment, and that is technological change, right? So that as of 2017, we have lots of more automation in production processes, machines, robots that do the types of tasks and jobs that used to be done by workers. But then with the start of the 1990s, another force gained momentum that can potentially also explain this manufacturing decline, and that is globalization. And with globalization, I specifically mean the dramatic rise of China in the world economy. I mean, that rise of China started in the 1980s with the pro-market reforms of leader Deng Xiaoping. And as we all know, back in the 1980s, China was still essentially a closed economy, right, with very few connections to the outside world and very low trade volumes, but this has vastly changed since then. Right, so there's been massive productivity growth in China, a massive improvement of market access that culminated, in a sense, in 2001 in the Chinese WTO accession. And the question is if this rise of China in the world economy has been sort of a game changer for manufacturing workers in the United States and in other traditional Western market economies. So this question about the so-called China shock has been addressed in highly influential research by economists David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson, who analyzed the effects of this rise of China in the US labor market. And you have also seen David Autor present his work here as part of this lecture series. We should look at that figure and say that over the 1990s, American imports from China have really soared, especially after the WTO accession in 2001, while the manufacturing employment share has continued to decrease. So these Chinese imports to the United States have been surely very beneficial to consumers in the United States who gained access to new and cheaper products. But the research by Autor, Dorn, and Hansen has shown that at the same time, this rise of China had adverse labor market effects, especially for manufacturing workers in the United States. So in absolute terms, when you compare 2000, roughly the year of the WTO accession of China, and 2014, in absolute terms, there have been 5 million manufacturing jobs less in 2014 than in 2000. Right? And by now, there's kind of a consensus in the literature by various people, including also, for example, Paul Krugman, who calculated that of those 5 million jobs that disappeared in manufacturing, in American manufacturing, roughly 1 million, or 20% of that decline, can be attributed to the rising Chinese import penetration. With the rest, which is still the majority, 80% or 4 million jobs, having still other causes, most likely ongoing technological progress. But still, 1 million jobs is a notable number, right? And it's a very important question to understand if that is a general lesson. So if rising Chinese import competition generally for other Western market economies has this tendency that leads to decline of manufacturing jobs and hurts manufacturing workers, or if that story is sort of a specific special case that's only relevant for the United States. And actually, there's some reason to believe that the situation of the United States actually had quite some special features. And so, as you all know, the US has run and still runs a very large current account deficit, which is to a large extent due to a large bilateral trade deficit with China. Right? So in the 1990, or in the year 1990, the current account was basically closed, but since then it fueled up dramatically. So here in this talk, I don't want to focus on the causes of this current account deficit in the United States, which stems from aggregate saving and investments decisions. But I want to rather focus on the labor market consequences of this. And this, I think, can be illustrated in the simplest possible way by a very, very simple graphical model that I actually owe largely to Paul Krugman. So when you think what a current account deficit actually means, it essentially means that the country, United States, consumes more than it produces. So let's just broadly distinguish two types of consumption goods, call them tradable and non-tradable goods, where for simplicity, I just equalize tradable goods with manufacturing and non-tradable goods with services, which is roughly true. So now the consumption of non-tradable goods, no, the production of non-tradable goods necessarily must be done domestically, since those goods cannot be traded. Right? And so the figure shows pretty clearly that such a trade deficit constellation then tends to come with a lower production share of tradable goods, i.e. with relatively fewer manufacturing jobs. So notice the model does not say that imports or even excessive imports or current account deficit lead to fewer jobs in total. It makes a statement about the composition of jobs and says that the current account deficit is associated with a lower share of manufacturing workers, right? Or fewer manufacturing jobs, not fewer jobs in total. So an interpretation of this very simple model is that it may not be the rise of China per se that has led to this decrease of manufacturing employment or to the loss of the 1 million manufacturing jobs in the United States, but that this is actually due to the very specific constellation that we observe there, namely the large trade deficit. Or in other words, that the US has vastly imported from China and consumed Chinese goods to the benefit of consumers, but exported relatively little to the newly emerging markets in China. So with this observation, let me actually turn to Germany and tell you about some of my own research that I've been doing, mostly together with Wolfgang Daut and Sebastian Findeisen. So let's have a look at the German data. So also Germany received a China shock, like basically all countries in the world did. So that can be seen here in the left figure. So going back to the 1980s, German trade volumes with China were essentially zero. So then, starting with the 1990s, trade quickly picked up and kind of exploded after 2000, the WTO accession. And you can see in the figure, this is not only true for imports, so German imports from China, but as the figure makes clear, in the German case, we have also seen a very strong increase of exports to the new markets in China. Not quite as much as the imports, so the bilateral trade deficit of Germany, or the bilateral trade balance of Germany with China has a slight deficit, but the volume of that is not even near to the numbers that we see in the United States. So for Germany, I should say that in the 1990s, it was not only the China shock that happened from the perspective of trade, right? But there was another very important shock, and that is the fall of the Iron Curtain and the transformation of countries in Eastern Europe to market economies, and that from a German perspective just happened next door, right? So it's not surprising to see, given what we know about the gravity structure of international trade, that after 1990, starting also from almost zero trade flows between Germany and Eastern Europe, that the increases of trade flows with Eastern Europe, which is a collection of 21 Eastern European countries, so essentially the former Eastern European bloc, right? That this increase, both on the import and on the export side, has been even stronger than in the case of China. So therefore, in our research, we not only look at this so-called China shock and the effects of rising trade with China on the German labor market, but actually on the effects of what we call the East. And the East is essentially the collection or the sum of China and Eastern Europe. So this table here shows you what is actually traded between Germany and the East on the import and export side. So the left part shows you the export structure of Germany to those destinations. And actually German exports are fairly similar across almost all destinations, right? So the top export item is, of course, as you can imagine, cars, right? But also machinery, pharmaceuticals, or let's say, generally speaking, investment goods. On the import side, there are some differences. There's more intra-industry trade with Eastern Europe than with China. But by and large, the imports, the German imports from the East consist of relatively simpler, less technology-intensive, more labor-intensive consumption goods. For example, office equipment, textiles, furniture, and so on and so forth. So notice that Germany, in the aggregate, runs a trade surplus and also a slight trade surplus with respect to the East. So the little simple model from before Therefore, it suggests that globalization, right, so the strong increase in trade and the emergence of these new countries in the world economy will probably affect the German labor market in a different way than the American labor market, given these different current account constellations. So you see it here. The current account surplus means the country consumes less than it produces, right? And then by the same logic, that will imply that a current account surplus constellation tends to come with a relatively higher share of workers active in the manufacturing sector to basically produce the goods for the export market. So notice again, it doesn't mean that a current account surplus leads to more jobs in total. I'm just saying to more manufacturing jobs and relatively fewer jobs in the service industry. Right? So what does the evidence say? So here I have an overview of broad sectoral employment trends of the German economy since 1993. And maybe surprisingly, what you see that the aggregate trend of structural change in Germany is not that different from the United States. Right? So also in Germany, we see by and large, you see here the green figure is services, black is total employment, red here is manufacturing. So from 1993, we also see in Germany an increasing service employment and a decreasing manufacturing employment, very similar as in the United States. But upon closer inspection, when you look at the manufacturing employment, you see some very important, interesting shifts within manufacturing. In particular, when we distinguish different manufacturing industries according to their net trade exposure with respect to the East, we find a strong and continuous job loss in import-competing manufacturing industries. But in contrast, the export-oriented manufacturing sector, so for example, the automobile industry, right? Employment in those export-oriented manufacturing sectors is very stable since 1996 at around 5 million jobs in total, and that hasn't really changed until today. So how to interpret this evidence in the light of this very simple model? I think the best way to think about it is that also Germany is exposed to a general technology trend, like all advanced economies, automation, robots, machines, right, which substitute workers for machines, right, and that happens in the manufacturing sector, so that leads to a secular decline of manufacturing employment due to technology and technology alone. But unlike in the case of the United States, in the German case, this technology trend was not reinforced by globalization and trade, but in the German case, trade actually worked in the opposite direction, right, against the manufacturing employment decline. And trade per se in the aggregate has retained manufacturing jobs in the German economy. And that is actually quite a difference to the American case. Right? But then there's another important aspect of how trade affects labor markets, which I try to symbolize here with these circles, right? And that is, I mean, trade causes industrial change, right? So if you look into any textbook model of international trade, you will find statements that countries specialize on industries where they have a comparative advantage, where they're relatively good at. So, for example, automobile industry in the German case, and you de-specialize in sectors where you have a comparative disadvantage, say textile industry. And you would expect a flow of labor out of these declining import-competing industries into the expanding export-oriented manufacturing industries. That's the channel that drives almost any traditional textbook trade model. But the research around the China shock for the United States has shown that this reallocation of labor across sectors is a very, very difficult and painful process for the involved workers, because they cannot easily switch jobs, occupations, and industries, but that for the single worker, this is a very, very painful process. So therefore, I would like to have a look at these adjustment costs and labor flows now for the case of Germany, right? Because this is a different question than the aggregate implication of trade for manufacturing employment. So that those frictions actually exist, that can already be seen if you look at the detailed labor flows of workers that are behind those broad aggregate trends that I've shown you before. So now I admit this matrix on the left is very difficult to read. So let me summarize the essence for you in a very simple graphical way. So think of the German economy as just consisting of three broad sectors: services, import manufacturing, and export manufacturing. And we would expect that workers flow out of import manufacturing into services and to a lesser extent into export manufacturing. But if you look in the data, what you will find is that the net annual flows, so the flows between these three broad sectors, the net flows, I mean, they're gross flows in all directions, but if you calculate the net flows, how many workers switch from one of those sectors to any other sector in a representative year since 1993, you will realize that these labor flows are super small. So for example, this flow here, from import to export manufacturing, which is kind of the canonical flow of workers that you would expect in a standard trade model. On average, between 1993 and 2014, that net flow has consisted of just 2,000 workers in Germany. And I'm talking about a labor market with almost 30 million workers, right? And that flow was 2,000 workers, which is almost nothing. So what happened? How does the labor market work, right? And how do the labor flows look like? In the vast majority, where a worker is no longer active in the same sector where he has been active in the previous year, right? What happens is that workers transit into non-employment or unemployment, right? So that flow is far more pervasive than direct job switches from one sector to the other. And in fact, you find that the expansion of the service sector and the relatively stable employment in the export manufacturing is actually entirely due by returnees from non-employment and newly entering young workers who newly enter the labor market, but it doesn't come at all from direct switchers from import manufacturing to other sectors. So it's really that the textbook model, which predicts that these workers from import manufacturing, like textile, that they just move quickly to export manufacturing or services, in the data that just does not exist. It's super small. All the expansion comes from returnees from non-employment and new labor market entrants. Or another way of looking at this is to say that this transition of a worker out of import manufacturing to a different sector typically comes with an unemployment spell, right, and goes via unemployment. So this evidence here is just purely descriptive and really suggests that adjustment costs really matter from the perspective of individual workers, right? So, but we have spent, to see this more specifically, I mean, we have conducted a battery of very detailed empirical econometric exercises which look at the causal effect of trade on those work biographies of roughly 1.2 million manufacturing workers in Germany. So the results are here, and the precise research design is summarized here. It's again a bit difficult to read, so let me actually summarize the essence of our findings just with examples. So this graph here shows representative work biographies in a highly import competing industry. Here I've chosen the radio and television set industry, which is highly import competing in the German case. So workers in this industry who started out in this industry, say in 1990, they faced a substantially higher risk of becoming unemployed at some point than the typical manufacturing worker. And what the graph here does, it compares a worker, or the biography of a worker who was involuntarily displaced from his job in this radio and television industry. So we can really be sure that's an involuntary displacement, not a voluntary displacement from the job. And we compare this worker to a otherwise similar, comparable worker who has managed to maintain and keep his job in that industry. So both workers in this radio and TV industry, they experience a downward trend in their earnings. Right? So as you can see here, their earnings really decline from one year to the next. Right? And this is at least partly driven by the effect of import exposure that these workers experience. Now then, the displaced worker who loses his job here at this point is kind of pushed out of his job. But typically, in the representative case, right? Of course, there are always exceptions when you have a sample of 1.2 million workers, right? But the typical case is that this displaced worker is not pulled into a new job in his own original radio and TV industry or in a different manufacturing industry. But the typical biography of that worker is that he goes to unemployment, stays at unemployment for a while, and then eventually returns, but then in the service sector for a relatively low-paid service job. And basically that worker never picks up again to his previous wage level. And also he performs much worse compared to his otherwise similar colleague who maintained his job in the radio and TV industry. Right? So this worker really we can think of as having a really hard time on the labor market because of globalization, right? Or if you want the catchy term, a globalization loser. So the second graph makes a similar comparison, but now for workers in the strongly export-oriented automobile industry. So these workers, compared to the average worker, have experienced notable on-the-job wage increases from year to year that you can see here, right? So this worker is on an upward trajectory and earns more in every year, right? These wage gains also may come from within industry changes, right, from one automobile firm to another. Now, displacement, right, involuntary moves into unemployment, they're much rarer for many, or within the automobile industry. I mean, they still happen. They're much rarer than in other industries. If they happen, right, so the displaced automobile worker also has this earnings dip here, right? So losing your job is never good news. It's always painful. But the difference is that the displaced automobile worker, he recovers much quicker, right? And almost after a while picks up to the previous wage level, right? And one plausible hypothesis is because he will always lose kind of firm-specific human capital when losing the job with the original employer, but he may not lose industry-specific human capital because he has a good chance of getting a new job in the original industry, in the car industry. So the more general lesson of this is that rising import penetration has indeed left some lasting damages on the work biographies of the exposed workers, which means that also in Germany there are considerable frictions involved, similarly as in the US, but in Germany there have also been these success stories of workers in export-oriented manufacturing industries. And those we can actually put on a map that you see here, because import and export-oriented manufacturing industries, they are not randomly allocated in space. Those industries tend to be concentrated in certain German regions. And so the blue regions here tend to be regions with a strong concentration of export-oriented manufacturing. So you will see, if you know a little bit about the geography of Germany, the areas here in Bavaria and around Stuttgart, around the big car producers. So the red areas, in contrast, are the areas where you have a strong concentration of import-competing manufacturing. So most notably here, the Ruhr area, which you see here, but also here the Pfalz, which has a strong concentration of textile industry, or here Oberfranken, which actually has a strong concentration in consumer electronics, like, for example, the radio and TV example from before. So notice that I've left Eastern Germany out of the picture because Eastern Germany has a much lower manufacturing share overall, and therefore is a bit more isolated from globalization shocks. But if you do the calculation, for West Germany, as I've said before, in the aggregate, globalization has led to an increase of manufacturing jobs for Germany as a whole, right? But that was very unequally distributed across space. So our estimations, they imply that due to this rise of the East, roughly 500,000 or a bit more than 500,000 jobs, they have been disappearing. Right? And that happened mainly in those red areas on the map. In contrast, there have been slightly 1 million new jobs created, mainly in the blue areas on the map. But the point is, given what I've said about adjustment costs, it is not that the workers who have lost their jobs in the red areas on the map, that those are the ones who take up the new jobs in the blue areas. Typically, the new jobs are filled with other people, and the people who have lost their jobs in the red areas, they were the ones that had labor market problems. So let me conclude with some thoughts about policy. Actually, when I say winners and losers from globalization, it's very hard to say if the losers have actually lost in absolute terms or just relative to the winners, right? Because we are focusing on the labor market and many benefits of trade, decreasing product prices, new product varieties, they're all left out of the picture. Right? So we cannot really say if the losers are losers in an absolute sense, right? But we should remind ourselves that economic theory actually makes clear-cut predictions about the proper welfare effects of trade, right? So there's, for example, the very famous Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which says that essentially trade enlarges the overall pie, but leads to a reduction in portion sizes in absolute terms for some workers or some people in society, right? The answer to this is not protectionism, so not the idea that we can enlarge portions by shrinking the overall pie again, right? So the classical recipe that economists would prescribe is that we can compensate the losers, right? And with great interest, I've read the recent joint policy report of the WTO, joined with the IMF and the World Bank, which is very much inspired by this idea of compensating the losers, which in theory should be easy to do because the cake grows, right? And that report tries to say what should be done in practice. So I think our research can contribute to that discussion by first saying that actually we face two related but separate problems. Right? So the first is what I would call the Stolper-Samuelson problem, right? Because that happens even in a perfectly competitive environment without any adjustment frictions or costs. Just because trade shifts prices and relative demands for factors, right? So those problems, those distributional problems of trade, they have to be tackled by redistributive policies, for example, via the tax system or social security. Right? But then related to that, and I think our work on the China shock has made clear that on top of that, there's a second problem, namely the adjustment costs, that workers cannot easily switch between sectors. And probably the workers who face these adjustment costs are the same workers who are also kind of hurt from the usual Stolper-Samuelson effect. Right? So it's really kind of urgent to help those workers who kind of suffer two related but separate problems. Now, the adjustment cost, tackling the adjustment cost is typically done by targeted specific labor market policies that come under the heading of trade adjustment assistance. And that also very much dominated the joint policy report of the WTO. So that's my last slide. Let me just say one word about trade adjustment assistance. So the general idea of that is basically qualification and retraining of workers who have lost their job because of trade. Right? And the goal of that trade adjustment assistance is to just lead to a faster recovery of those workers into better jobs. Okay? These programs, they exist in the United States, they also exist in the European Union with low volumes, right? And they kind of overlap also with existing labor market policies. I think they're very useful and they're very important, but one dimension maybe a bit neglected in the report, and that is this regional dimension I've shown you, okay? So within countries like Germany, in the United States and also other countries, the labor market problems, the displacement, the adjustment costs, they tend to be concentrated in certain regions, right, which are really heavily affected and hit by import shocks, right? And then tackling this problem just with qualification and retraining can be difficult if there are no adequate jobs basically in the region available, right? So it's just trade adjustment assistance tackles labor supply, but there can be a labor demand problem if no adequate jobs are close by. Of course, you can say we can foster regional mobility and just try to induce these workers to move to other regions where the labor market works better. But this can be problematic, as we've also seen in recent elections, that it may not be a good idea to kind of leave certain regions in the country behind, and therefore, and I leave that to the discussion, I think there should be a point of complementing this trade adjustment assistance, which is labor supply oriented, with more labor demand oriented structural and regional policy, which tries to bring adequate jobs to these regions which have lost from globalization. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Jens, for this very interesting presentation and very clear presentation. I'll turn now immediately to Farid and give you the floor. So,
We need to
sorry.
just
Yeah.
like
Sure. Switch. You want to?
maybe not switch, but just like upload my.
This
file.
one?
Yes. Thank you.
Did you use it?
Yes. Oh, well, it's... Okay. Switch it on. I think I switched it off. How it works.
It works. Okay, this is a real pleasure to be here and to discuss about this this subject, technology, trade, and structural change, for this special lecture. I really appreciated the former seminar, the former talk of Jens, and he broke in his conclusion the labor demand side, and this is mostly what I would like to talk about. I mean the labor demand. So if you look at structural changes, what we see that our economies, mostly the OECD economies, have undergone rapid structural changes across sectors over the last decades. And if I look at the share of French employment in services, this is 55% in the 80s. Actually, this is 81, and 75% in the 2010s. And basically, these structural shifts from manufacturing to services, and we've got a couple of new and recent papers dealing with this shift, might be manifested in terms of industry composition, the fact that we switch from chemical industry to more precise services industry, but also occupational composition, and this is what I will deal in this lecture, and of course in terms of wage distribution. This structural shift is not one-to-one related to job polarization, but can lead to job polarization. So what is job polarization? This is the decline in employment share of middle wage jobs and the growth in both high and low wage jobs. And this has been documented everywhere using macro level data in the UK, in the US, continental Europe as well, and recent evidence in Northern Europe as well. So what are the main drivers of this polarization? We've got two main drivers. I do not deny the supply shift. What I would just like focus on is labor demand. So on the side of the labor demand, you've got technology, and you've got this famous routinization hypothesis, and basically most of the literature converge and tells you that this is one of the most important forces shaping the workforce. And what does it tell you? It tells you that basically technology will substitute the mid-class workers. Okay, so you've got technology, the diffusion of information and communication technology, ICT, will lower the demand for routine occupation employment, and those workers that are working on those tasks are in the mid of the wage distribution, are in the middle of the wage distribution. And then it tells you also that ICT will complement non-routine cognitive occupation, and those workers are the most paid workers. They are on the top of the distribution, and you've got a residual demand for people with low skilled. So basically, the routinization hypothesis tells you that technology will lead to polarization of our labor markets. There is another driver that has been acknowledged in the literature. This is globalization, and globalization means many things. You've got offshoring, okay? This is the domestic labor, the one that we have in France will be substituted by labor abroad. And you've got a bunch of paper telling you that this is indeed the case. And we have here in the previous talk also seen a recent evidence on that. And you've got also the effect of exporting. This is not only offshoring, this is exporting that might matter, because exported is linked to higher demand of high-skilled workers. So basically it will shift labor demand toward those high-skilled workers. So not only offshoring, the import competition, but also exporting might matter for explaining job polarization. So technology and trade are the main drivers. And again, this is looking at the demand side mechanism. there might be many things related to job polarization, regulation, migration, other things that are coming from the supply side, okay, the education and so on and so forth. But let's look at this job polarization through the lens of the demand side. There is one picture that I'd like to show you. This is this one. This is France, 1960, and India, 2010, and we are in Renault, in a Renault factory. So you've got the Renault factory in both years, and this car that you see here, this is a Dauphine, and what I want to, the famous car at that time, and what I want to show you here is just like you had production workers, they were operating routine tasks, and there are 4 people around each car. Okay, each Dauphine has four workers, 4 industrial workers. Now you switch to 2010. Renault Renault merged with Nissan joint venture at the beginning of the at the end of the 90s. We are in Chennai. What you see at the far end of this picture, you see this guy here is an engineer. He's a techie. Okay, and basically you see that there is nobody around those cars except robots. So you have, at the same time, from the 60s to the 2010s, you've got 2 things operating. You've got globalization, the fact that actually I can displace my works around a different place in the world, but you've got also technology. So those 2 impacts, those 2 forces are playing a major role. What I want to say also, here I took the example on purpose. I'm not talking about industry, I'm not talking about region, I'm talking about firms. Because at the end, this is the firms that make its labor demand. Okay, so the length through which we will analyze job polarization and the structural changes are not at the level of industries or at the level of the regions. This is at the level of the firm. The firm is the one that at the end make decision on workers and the type of workers within each entities. Okay, so we will analyze the cause of changes in the structure of employment, occupational change, through the lens of firms. So how do we identify the impact of globalization and technology? So by recalling that most of economic activities, not all of them, of course, but most of the economic activities are organized by firms. They decide on the composition of workers. They make also internal changes. I mean, the fact that I switch from domestic to exporter, from exporter to multinational firms, this is made internally. This decision is an internal organization decision. And they might be important factors driving structural change. They also make decisions about about labor demand. I mean, I read so many papers about the French labor market, which is a typical market in a sense, because actually this is a really rigid market. But most of the people that are working on this on the French labor market, that tells you that you've got collective bargaining. This is true, but actually at the end, this is the firms that decide. Okay, this is a firm that decide. It decide on the level of employment, decide on the occupational structure, it decide on the wages, and since it decide on the wages, you've got the entire distribution of wages, which will be basically driven by the firm decision. Well, to the extent that education and so on, given education and the supply shift as well. No? And the other thing is, well, when you look at industries, or within industry, you've got huge heterogeneity. I mean, the industry level analysis may mask substantial heterogeneity. You've got exporters within industry, firms that remain domestic, firms that decide to go abroad, having affiliates abroad. All those decisions are made within industry. So within industry, we've got a bunch of different firms, small firms, big firms, and an entire set of different organizations. Let me tell you something about that. I just want to juxtapose 2 key papers in the literature, I believe. This is the Berman-Baum-Griliches and the Bernard and Jensen paper. So if you read these papers and if we analyze these papers, you see that actually Bernard, Baum, and Griliches find that the within industry change explains 70% of the increase in the relative demand for non-production workers in the US. So basically, this is the within industry change that matters. And what they show in this paper, they show that basically globalization cannot account for much of this change. Okay, we have a within industry. This is an industry level analysis. And then you look at Bernard and Jensen, the paper by Bernard and Jensen. They use the same underlying firm level data as in Berman, Bond, and Grilich's. And what they show is that, well, the variation in firm size explains 60% of the increase, okay? And most of this variation is driven by exporters. So this is globalization that matters for inequality and not just like within industry changes. So if you use the industry level analysis, you might just like hide nice features that are just like at the level of the firm. So what I will do, and I do that with a bunch of co-authors, I will analyze the impact of globalization and technological change in a series of research papers with James Harrigan, Ariel Reshef, and other colleagues. So let me show you this type of analysis using the French data. So what we do, we've got access to the full private sectors in France, and we draw some empirical regularities using this match employee data set, which is an administrative data set. So this is not a survey here, this is the administrative data set. What you see in this picture, you see just like the occupational wage rank of each occupation, okay? So from the lowest paid to the highest paid worker, okay? You've got the occupation marked by these numbers, okay? So 37, this is top managers, 38, this is techies, etc., etc. The size of the circle tells you the size of this occupation in the economy, okay, at the beginning of the period, or average across those years, 94 to 2007. So you see that in non-manufacturing, for example, mid-management is really pregnant. Office workers, this is also a big occupation. But actually, what we can do, we can look at the change in those hours made by each of those occupations. So what you see that basically, if you look at office workers, you've got a drop of the number of hours performed by those office workers from 94 to 2007. Same thing happened to mid-management. And what you see in the non-manufacturing sector, mostly services sectors, you see that the winners are top managers and techies, okay? Plus people that are in the services sectors, retail workers, personal services workers, and low-skill manual workers. So you've got a polarization of occupation that happen in the non-manufacturing sector. Okay, so this is what we observe when we look at the full set of data for France. This is the full private sector in France in the services sector. This is the private sector in France, but we focus on the services sector. This pattern that we observe here in the services sector, this is pretty consistent to the routinization hypothesis. You've got substitution, okay, between workers, okay, in these services sectors, and there are kind of workers that are not substitutable, drivers, for example. We cannot just like replace drivers yet by computers. Now let's just like focus on the manufacturing sectors. And what we see in the manufacturing sectors, first, what we observe, same graph, what we observe that the composition of the occupation is not the same. Okay, there are occupations that do not exist in the manufacturing sector. I'm thinking about personal services, for example, it does not exist. But what you see that you are winners and losers. You've got an increase in the share of hours work performed by skilled industrial workers and techies and top managers, and a decrease in the share of low-skilled industrial workers. So basically in the manufacturing sectors, you don't observe polarization. What you observe is skill upgrading. Okay, so those workers that are low-skilled workers basically tend to shrink, this occupation tend to shrink, and those workers that are high-skilled workers, this occupation tend to expand. Okay, so you've got skill upgrading in this sector. Now, what we can do is just like think about where does the effect come from. Okay, so where does this effect come from? And when you have firm-level data, what you can do, you can just like decompose the effect of the change in one occupation. So this is the change in one occupation, call it SO. This is an occupation O. This is a change in this occupation O, into a between effect, okay, and a within effect. So don't focus too much on the math. What it tells you the within effect tells you that there is a substitution within firm between workers, okay, between occupation within firms. So it tells you the extent of these changes within firms. So I hire more skilled workers and I will hire less unskilled workers. And the first effect, the between effect, this is what we call the composition or the competitiveness effect. The fact that when a firm is intensive in one occupation, and when the firm increase, grow, this occupation will automatically grow. So basically, the size of the firm will be a determinant. The increase in the size of the firm will be a determinant for the increase of this occupation because this firm is intensive in this occupation. So the between effect, it will be large when firms growth occurs in O-intensive firms, and the within effect will be large when O-intensity increase in large firms. So you've got substitution versus competitiveness, basically. So think about the routinization hypothesis. If you think about the routinization hypothesis, you should have the effect should mostly be driven by substitution, okay, and not by competitiveness. So we substitute basically through, because of this ICT revolution, we will substitute workers. So workers will be substituted when they perform routine tasks by technology, so they will disappear. There is a substitution effect. Now, let's look at our occupation and disentangle between those two effects, the between and the within. And this is what we do in this graph. So we've got all the occupation as before, the 14 largest occupation in France. So from 37 to 68. We see that actually the techies, they grow in size, okay? We see actually that office workers, and the total is in black here, office workers reduce in size. This is a change in percentage point, so this is a big effect. But what we see mainly, we see that actually substitution matter, substitution with broad PCS fit the routinization hypothesis. This is still here. We've got a within effect for example, the 64. You've got a within effect for the 66. But the between effect will dominate for many important PCS code, PCS being the occupation. So basically, if I just take two examples, let's focus on the skilled industrial workers and let's focus on the low skilled industrial workers. The skilled industrial workers, we see just like a drop in the total share of those total number of hours that were performed by the skilled industrial workers, and most of the effect is the within effect. Okay, so this is just like substitution of these within industrial workers within firm. So, and when we look at the low skilled industrial workers, we see a drop, but this drop is mostly due to the fact that actually the firms that were really intensive in low skilled industrial workers, they shrink in size. So they lose competitiveness. So losing competitiveness means actually that those workers will also shrink. The share of those occupations will shrink. So basically, you've got a within pattern for the skilled workers and a between pattern for the low skilled industrial workers. So we can do the same decomposition within and between industries, growth in the industry versus within industry substitution. What we find clearly using this French firm level data, we find that the change in occupational shares will occur between firms and within industries. So the firms matter for explaining those changes. Okay, so what are the main drivers of occupational changes? First, we have trade at firm level. So here we can match actually not only occupation, we can also know where the firm is exporting, where the firm is importing from. We can know everything about the firm. So we've got trade at firm level, export and imports. But we also have an indicator of technology at the firm level. So usually most of the people are using R&D. Okay, R&D expenditure to approximate this change at the level of the firm. Here, what we can do, having really detailed information at firm level on occupation, we can just look at the techies within firm. The share of techies is just like a reasonable approximation of the technology adoption of those firms. So techies, they basically develop, install, maintain ICT and other technology. And if we look at the decomposition of those techies, most of them, they are in ICT. Okay, so they are in ITC, sorry. So if you look at the literature, those techies are the link between economy-wide technological progress and firm-level technology adoption. So those techies are a good approximation of the adoption of technology at the firm level. Okay. So now let's look at the exposure to trade and the exposure to techies. We take each occupation and we look at their exposure to trade. So this is the occupational share of trade relative to occupational share of hours. So to discuss this graph, you have to just like think that one is when you are, that is we normalize basically when you are above one, when this this index is above one, you are really exposed to trade. When you are below one, you are not exposed at all to trade. And we can just like compute the exposure of each occupation to international trade, both export and import. And what we see that actually we've got heterogeneity across occupation. Some workers are exposed to trade. This is top managers, technical managers, technicians, supervisors, but also high-skilled industrial workers, skill distribution as well, okay? And some workers are not at all exposed to trade. This is high-skilled manual, drivers, personal services, and so on. So you've got an heterogeneity across occupation. You've got workers that are exposed to trade and workers that are just like not too exposed to trade. We can do exactly the same thing for technology. Who are the workers that are exposed to technology and who are the workers that are not exposed to technologies? And what we find that basically, we find that there are some workers, you've got the same heterogeneity. There are some workers that are exposed to technology and that there are some workers that are not exposed to technology. For example, the top of the say wage distribution is exposed to technology, then personal services are not. High-skilled industrial workers are really exposed to technology, skill distribution as well, and so on and so forth. There seems to have a correlation between those two things. You've got a correlation between those two exposure, the exposure to trade and the exposure to technology, okay? But actually the correlation is not perfect. So now what I want to tell you, well, in order to know who is driving polarization and who is driving skill upgrading, basically who is driving occupational change, you need to run sound econometric analysis, okay? So to distinguish this effect, you run sound econometric analysis, and I have just like listed the impact on two things. The first thing, I listed the impact of technology and trade on competitiveness, the composition effect, and I listed the impact of technology and trade on the within part, on the substitution effect, okay? So let's look at the impact of techies and trade on firm-level employment growth, okay? What we find in the paper with James Harrigan and Ariel Reshef, we find that techies cause faster growth, both in manufacturing and non-manufacturing. This is pervasive everywhere. There is no China effect, and exporting has no effect. What we find that when you take imports as a whole, there is no effect of imports on the competitiveness, the growth of firms, the growth in the size of firms. But actually, what you look when you look at when you disentangle between where this input is coming from, where this trade is coming from, is it trading goods, trading inputs, then when you refine the analysis, you find something, and you find that actually import of intermediates or from poor country reduce growth in manufacturing firms, and this is consistent with basically the offshoring story. So you've got a substitution between imports and employment at the firm level. Now, what is the order of magnitude for the composition effect? Well, this is really large, basically. So if we compare firms at the 50th and 0th percentile and the techie share of the techie share of hours, the former, the firm in the 50th percentile, they experience a 23% faster employment growth in manufacturing, and let's say more than 10%, 11% faster employment growth in non-manufacturing. So basically, technology boosts employment growth, okay? So this boosts employment growth. And if I look at the trade effect now, what I see that if I compare a firm in the manufacturing sector at the 50th percentile and at the 0th percentile, the firm that has 15%, at the 50th percentile, sorry, of trade in intermediate input, see a 20% slower employment growth relative to the firms that have no import. So you've got a reduction in employment growth by firms that import intermediate inputs. So this is the magnitude of the effect has to be appreciated over the period 2002-2007. Okay, so those are basically big effects. Okay, what about the within firm substitution effect? So when we look at within firm, so do we see that actually technology and trade matters for the substitution within firms, of occupation within firms? So what we see that techies will cause skill upgrading in non-manufacturing, and it will cause polarization in manufacturing. This is what we find. Then we find, in line with the offshoring literature, we find that actually techies will, importing will cause blue-collar skill upgrading in manufacturing, and exporting will boost the growth in managers, which is consistent with a non-production and production ratio among exporters that many other authors have found, and the exporting will cause blue-collar skill downgrading that has not been found previously in the literature. So you've got also a within substitution effect that is triggered by technology and import and export and trade, and this is at the firm level. Similar effect for other European countries. Well, the falling ICT prices, which raise the competitiveness effect of firms, is found in many other studies, in particular the studies by Gretz and Michael for OECD countries. It is found for European countries in Guzmaning and Salomon. It is found by Gregory Salomon and Ziran in 2016. So you've got a decrease in ICT prices that will raise the competitiveness of firms. What about the impact of offshoring? You've got this nice paper by Keller and Utah in 2016 that shows you that import competition with China account for about 70% of the aggregate decline in mid-wage employment in Denmark using Danish data. So basically, the effect seems to be found in previous and other literature on other sample. Do we find a similar effect for trading services? I was talking about trading goods. Then there might be the fear that actually, because trading services embody tasks that are more skilled, that trading services will just like displace also high-skilled workers. And this is what people will call the fear of services offshoring, and it was pointed by Amity and they. So the fact that actually services will substitute for high-skilled workers as well. Using the French firm-level data, what we find that services trade bring polarization at trading good. Okay, so there is polarization that is just like also triggered by services offshoring. So white-skilled worker, white-collar workers are winning from the liberalization in trading services and the volume of trading services. Unskilled blue-collar workers are also gaining from this services offshoring, and the one that just like are in the middle of the wage distribution, the skilled blue-collar workers, they lose from this offshoring of services. To go a little bit deeper, I mean, one question that we might ask is it just like import competition? So the fact that you are in an import competing industry, or is it just like relocation? The fact that you've got multinational firms that displace workers across border. The first thing that you have to think about is just like multinational firms are really large. They constitute a large share of employment, of domestic employment. If I look at multinational firms in France, they account for 24% of total French manufacturing employment, which is 1/4 of French manufacturing employment is actually made by multinational firms. So you've got a debate over the possible adverse effect of multinational firms on employment. Those firms will add to the process of deindustrialization, the hollowing out of our economies, because they can shift jobs from high cost or high labor standard location to low cost or low labor standard location. And then they can substitute domestic unskilled labor intensive workers for foreign unskilled labor intensive workers. So those guys might be suspected to just like shift jobs abroad. So what we have done is, with a colleague of mine from Michigan, we have looked at the hollowing out of the Japanese economy, basically during the long period, 1980 to 2000. And what we've done, we have looked at how those Japanese firms have relocated their activities, especially in '91 when Japan suffered from the financial crisis. So after '91, you have a huge appreciation of the yen, and the Japanese firms might have been inclined to just like locate their activity in Southeast Asia. And basically, this is what they've done. The problem is, when you look at this period for Japanese firm, is that, well, most of the firm, irrespective of the status, well, those firms have reduced their share of domestic employment. So the share of domestic employment reduces considerably, and this reduces for multinational firms, the firms that have multinational status, but also for domestic firms. So you need to pin down the effect, and identifying the effect is quite challenging, because you've got a reduction that is everywhere. It is by domestic employment, by domestic firms, it is by multinational firms, and it is even by firms that switch from domestic to multinational. So what we will do, we will apply some fancy econometrics, let's say, to compare firms in different status before and after 1991. Okay, so this is a triple difference analysis, and when we look at the triple difference analysis, this is mostly what we see. So you've got the annual percentage change in parent and overseas affiliate employment, 91 to 2000. And you see that, and you've got two squares, you've got two bars. The blue bars are Japanese parents. So this is the annual changes in parents, in parents located in Japan. And then you've got the annual changes for overseas affiliate, mostly in Southeast Asia. The figure is striking. Most of the domestic plant, the domestic parents of Japanese firms, just like reduces shrinking employment, and what you see an increase of employment in overseas location. So when we quantify the effect, you see that Japanese multinational firms have reduced their domestic employment by 0.17% per year from 92 to 2001, which is not a huge effect. And when you look at the detail of how this effect just like occurs, we see that this is mostly driven by fragmentation of the production process. So basically, the tasks that are performed by Japanese affiliates are not at all the same as the tasks that are performed by the Japanese parent. There is a huge fragmentation of the production process, mostly in East Asia. Concluding remark, how does the firm level analysis help? As I said, most of the economic activity is organized by firms. This is an important factor that drives structural change and change in wage distribution. You've got within industry, within location, change in types of firm, from domestic to exporter, from domestic to importers, from domestic to multinational entities. You've got also internal organization that might matter for structural change. This is offshoring, the occupational mix. You've got also within industry and within a unit of space, distribution of firms might change over time. So if you look at the firm level data, you are allowed to distinguish among competitive theory, substitution versus competitiveness, about the determinant of structural change and how this will affect the distribution of income. I do not deny the supply side mechanism. I just mentioned that actually one of the main drivers, this is the demand side mechanism. And in terms of policy implication, I really believe that, and this is true for this type of study, but others as well, I really believe that a better assessment of firms that are more likely to affect the overall pattern of employment and wage, if you've got a bunch of firms that do a quarter of employment in your economy, well, targeting these firms may be more effective than blanket policies in mitigating the underlying demand-side driving factors. And targeting these firms may keep also the cost of labor marketing regulation really low. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Farid. Many thanks for those two presentations. And we have a little bit of time for the questions and answers session. So I'll immediately open the floor to any questions you might have to either of the two speakers. No questions? Yeah, Robert?
Hi, my name is Robert, Pei from the WTO Secretariat. I was wondering about the figure from Jan's pseudonym, the wage profile that you had for import competing industries. So you had two profiles, one with the displaced worker and the other with the non-displaced worker. And I was just wondering what the time scale is for that profile. What is the duration, average duration of unemployment spells? And whether some of those displaced workers went through adjustment assistance programs, or did you control for that in terms of the comparison?
So thanks for the question. To explain it a little bit in more detail, so what we do there is kind of, we call it propensity score matching procedure, which means you look at a displaced worker in the industry, and then you look what we call a statistical sibling, right, which looks very, very similar in all respects, with the only difference that this worker has not been displaced. Right? So, and you see that, so therefore, in the pre-period before the displacement, you see that the wages of these two are really, really similar. So that means they are actually comparable. So then the displacement occurs, and what I've shown you, the figure, is not for one worker. It's really like the representative profile of all displaced workers. So I cannot really say, was there just one employment period or how long it took. If you remember the profile, you see really this dip in earnings, and then the recovery, which is very slow. And this recovery, there can be various reasons why the recovery is slow. So it could be you lose your job, you take up another job, you lose it again. And then eventually, I mean, after the third or fourth trial, you kind of get a permanent job. So that happens. But remember, I mean, these figures, they're constructed really from thousands of individuals. So and therefore, I cannot say like how long the unemployment period is, right? But what we can say for sure is that for these import-exposed workers, even 5-6 years after the displacement, they have not caught up to their previous wage, right? So therefore, these negative effects, they're really kind of long-term. Now, the second question, whether these workers have gone through trade adjustment, it's very unlikely because these programs, also for Germany, are very, very small scaled. So I've given you the numbers. I mean, for the whole European Union, we talk about 500 million over a time scale of 5 years, I think. So it's almost nothing. So these programs, they are really, really low volume. So these workers, they may have received a treatment from the national labor market policies, right? But probably not from these specific programs of the European Union which target these trade-induced workers.
Thank you. Any other questions? No other questions? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm Henning Envall from the Swedish delegation here in Geneva. Thank you very much, both professors, for really enlightening presentations. One question maybe for Professor Tobal. On your last conclusions there, what I didn't quite understand why you think it's necessary to know which firms are you should target for adjustment for measures to ease the structural changes. Isn't it individuals that you're trying to help rather than firms? Thank you.
Yes, but we know, I mean, I do not deny that. I mean, I perfectly understand your question, but we know that actually the decision to export or the decision to import, the fact that I will just like open a factory in China is made by the firm. And this decision, I mean, once you look at this big data that we have right now in Sweden, in France, in Germany, you can identify the firms that have those characteristics. Okay, so sometimes, and it is often true that a one-size-fits-all policy may be useless because you target the full sectors where actually one or two firms, those big firms, are driving most of the effect. So what you could do instead of just like targeting those sectors or those regions, you could just like look at firms and try to target them. And I think the benefits of that will be larger than actually a one-size-fits-all policy with a lot of complication for firms that actually are not just like trading or having affiliates in other countries.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yep.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I have a question to Professor Jens Suedekum. On your presentation, on your simple model, you mentioned tradables and non-tradables. And I was wondering if we talk about this in the context of digital trade, how this curve between tradables and non-tradables would be changed. Are you moving along the line, or would the line move, for example, would it be extended? And the second point is, just out of curiosity, if we look at the map of Germany, you mentioned the Ruhr of Lusing, but I saw there is also a blue field in the Ruhr, and I was wondering why in the Ruhr that you mentioned you have red and blue, and whether there is anything in a positive sense in terms of structural adjustment there.
Okay, so thank you very much. So maybe first the question. So I mean, the model is really, I think, one of the simplest economic models that you could think of, right? So it's not meant to be in any sense super realistic. But I think your point of digitalization, and I think I can generally say service trade, which will probably mean that over time we will have less and less non-tradable sectors, right? Because many, many more sectors, as a result of digitalization, become tradable, right? But here in my story, I mean, I really have in mind the 90s and the early 2000s, where trade, and especially in the German context, I really mean manufacturing trade. I mean, for the German case, manufacturing trade really dominates everything, if you look at the statistics. So therefore, I thought it's, even though it's not 100% correct, I associate tradables with manufacturing and non-tradables with services, knowing that this basically was never really true and will probably be totally untrue 5 years down the road. Right? So, but then turning to the blue spot in the Ruhr area, so now I have to think about my own geography of Germany. So actually, so I mean, basically, whether you're a red or blue dot here is really a reflection of your industry structure that you have basically locally. So the red dots, the losing regions, if you want, they have this strong concentration of import competing sectors. So in the Ruhr area is clear. The Ruhr area, for those who are not so familiar with Germany, is really like the German version of the Rust Belt, right? You could think about it like this. So heavy steel, coal and steel industry, essentially. But quite surprisingly, so I'm basically come from that area, you just drive 50 kilometers up north, you are in the Münsterland, which is completely different. So it's 50 kilometers away. You have a completely different industry structure, no heavy industry, a service-based economy. You have the industries where these typical, called hidden champions, are located, who are active in niche products, right? So they produce a very, very particular niche product as a medium-sized firm, and are essentially the world market leader for that particular niche product. And the blue dot here, that is actually part of that Münster area. So I think it's I'm not exactly sure which county it is, but that basically fits to that story that even 50 kilometers up north of the Ruhr area, you find a completely different industry structure. And here you can have globalization gains, for example, because you have these hidden champions, which are really world market leaders and are export champions in a very, very particular industry branch, right? And that just shows you that this local labor market dimension is really, really important, right? Because this globalization shock to the positive and negative side doesn't just hit Germany all the same. It's very, very different depending on where you look, right? And that's what I wanted to make clear. Thanks for the question. It can be even, let's say, on a very, very small scale, you can have losing and winning regions directly next to each other.
Yep, please.
Again, Katie Keeley from the U.S. Mission. Thank you so much for the presentation. Professor Sudicum, was wondering if you assess that your model can offer practical counsel for emerging market or post-conflict regions, or just those with existing similarly stable structures already in place, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, that general research agenda, it really has a focus on advanced, industrialized, rich countries like the US, like Germany. So there's comparable work now also for France, for Spain, for the United Kingdom, right? Because, I mean, when you think about world trade, I mean, when China entered 1990, right, we were really thinking of a relatively poor country entering world trade and having this fantastic rise, which from a Chinese perspective really was a super success story in terms of rising income and fighting poverty within China, right? And I think you can think of these labor market effects that I've been talking about as kind of the flip side. What happens? What are the effects of this rise of a low-wage developing country like China was in the 1990s? What does this imply for the labor markets of rich developed countries, right? For other developing countries, let's say in Latin America or Africa, I think it's a very different story what this rise of China implied for them, right? And my own research and the whole research of this China shock that I've been talking about, I think does not give practical guidance to the experiences of, for example, Latin American or African countries, how they were affected by the China shock. So there I probably would advise you to go to development economists who really focus on those type of questions.
I don't know if you want to add something to this question about the relevance of this work to developing countries.
No, but maybe one thing. I mean, even what the impact of China is not present in France. It depends really on structurally on where are your trading partners. Okay, so it might be indirect because one of the main important trading partner in France is Germany, but the impact is not there. What we about geopolarization and emerging market. I mean, there were a couple of years ago no studies on emerging markets and geopolarization, and actually now everything is pointing to really huge geopolarization effect also for emerging market. But the effect seems to be also large. I mean, this is what we can add on that topic.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mark Kahn from the WTO. I have a question for Professor Sudicum. When you talked about adjustment assistance, and you spoke about the recent report by WTO, IMF, and World Bank, and you basically agreed with what that report says about adjustment policies, but then I think you added something which I found quite interesting. You said what is missing here is the element of regional policy. Right? What you said basically, if I understand you correctly, was that the report approached the whole issue of adjustment from the perspective of labor supply. And you said we should also focus on labor demand, in particular through regional policy. Now, basically my question is, how realistic is this? And how do you, can you be a bit more concrete about how regional policy could be used as a form of adjustment policy? And the reason why I have this question is that if you look at the experience of the European Union, then of course regional policy traditionally was always part of the integration process. Now, I think what you see is that there seems to be much less enthusiasm today about what regional policy can do than 20 or 25 years ago. And of course we see when we talk about polarization, that the polarization in Europe is also polarization between the global cities and rural areas. So given that there seems to be some skepticism, at least in Europe, about what can be done with regional policy, can you say a bit more how you think, can you say a bit more about what concretely you think we can do with regional policy as an aspect of adjustment, as a policy to facilitate the adjustment process?
I think this is a very important question. So I mean, with regional policy, I mean, we have seen that there are these that the labor market problems caused by globalization are really focused on particular regions like the Ruhr area and the Südwestpfalz, right? And for those regions, it was really trade was like a macro shock, right? Which, in a sense, washed out. Let me focus, for example, on this textile region in the Südwestpfalz. They had a very active textile industry. Then, through globalization, that textile industry really was dramatically hit, and many jobs got lost in the textile industry. Right now, if you just do trade adjustment assistance as it's currently understood, you would try to turn these former textile employees into, let's say, service workers like web designers, right? Which is very difficult to do, right? And especially if like a whole region is focused on textile industry or on one industry, right? There are not that many adequate jobs in other industries close by. So the training efforts, right, to bring these people, the displaced workers, into new jobs can be very difficult if there are no adequate jobs next door. Okay, so now I agree, regional policy, there's lots of skepticism about regional policy because by definition almost it's not a policy that enhances growth at the national level. If you invest a euro, right, that euro will always have a higher rate of return if you invest that euro in the agglomeration regions, right? In New York or in Munich, let me talk about Germany, a euro invested in Munich always has a higher rate of return than a euro invested in the periphery, okay? But I mean, if the idea is that we want to help and compensate losers, right? How do we do it? I mean, how do we deal with people who have just lost their job in the textile industry in Südwestpfalz, right? I mean, one approach would be to say, okay, we compensate them with monetary transfers, right? So we decide kind of a compensation literally meant with monetary transfers. But I think this is not a reasonable policy, right? Typically, I mean, this assistance is about jobs, right? People don't want passive transfers. People want new opportunities and want new jobs. So now when you say, when you need a new job, you can tell these people, okay, move to Munich, right? They are the jobs. And that's also one branch of regional policy. It's called moving to opportunity. We can just basically foster and subsidize regional moves and say, people, look, the jobs are there, just move to Munich. Now, many people do that anyway. The young people, the educated people from those areas, they move anyway. They don't need any subsidies. What I'm saying is, for people who are in principle not mobile, right? Meet with people with low or medium education who have just bought a house, who pay off the mortgage, for example, it's very difficult for them to tell them, look, just move to Munich or commute to Munich to the new job. That is, I think, not realistic, right? And therefore, I think of regional policy as really like a practical way of redistribution policy. It's not done. Regional policy shouldn't be thought of as being a policy that enhances growth, right? But it's an effective way or possibility to redistribute globalization gains and help the losers, not by giving them money, but trying to give them jobs, right? And I'm not unrealistic. I know that regional policy cannot cause miracles, right? It will always be kind of not the super fancy jobs that will be subsidized in the periphery, right? But I think, I mean, since the service sector is on the rise, regional policy can be at least can contribute or should be seen as a complement to these trade adjustment assistance, because I think it's a matter of fact that many people just are not mobile. They want to stay where they are. They don't want monetary transfers. They want new jobs, and regional policy can try to help create some sort of medium paid jobs in the periphery. Right? That's I think what I think about it. I don't think of it this is like a wonder weapon. I think of it as a complement to existing trade assistance policies. Right? And I think it's important because I think look at you know, the Brexit vote, for example, or also at the presidential election. I mean, there was this narrative that there's this big divide between the cities and the periphery kind of having this perception that nobody cares about them, right? And if we go to the extreme and just tell people, look, I mean, if you want a new job, move to the city, right? That's a way of kind of leaving the periphery behind, and I think that has in the longer term very high social and political costs.
Thank you very much for those answers. I'm not sure we have, I mean, if there is a really pressing question, I'll take it, but that will be the last one. Otherwise, I think I'll thank our guests for those very interesting presentations, the very interesting responses to the questions we've had. And I'll sort of just mention to you that the series of trade dialogues lectures continues, and that the next one is on I'm sorry, I'm turning to Victor. June 6th. So the next one is on June 6th. It's all online, and I encourage you to continue to join us in those in this series and to listen to our guests. Many thanks to Farid and Jens, and